My name is Chris Newton. I head up Responsible Investment at IFM. Today's panel discussion will be on infrastructure and adaptation, and my son asked me today what I was going to do, and I was about to give him a long, eloquent description of adaptation and infrastructure and I told him that I was getting together with a few of my friends and we were going to protect the world from the evils of climate change. He then proceeded to ask me what Batman suit I was going to wear. I promise you I won't pull that one out. That might be for drinks later on. Just to put this one in context, and we'll do the introduction of the panel. Some of you, and it was just mentioned then, may have seen this report from the IGCC released earlier in the year. So thank you for that. So a lot of the topics we'll discuss today is around adaptation and infrastructure. Kudos to Kelly Christodoulou, I think is here for her coordination of this report. If you haven't seen it, do yourselves a favour and get a copy. Kudos to Molly Meldrum as well, of course. So just in terms of some of the statistics that are in that report, so I'll just go over them again just to refresh our memories. As many of us would know, the commitments we've all made for the Paris Agreement internationally will not get us to a 2-degree world. It will get us to around a 2.6 degree world. And so being ready to adapt for that climate change future, or low carbon, or not a low carbon economy, unfortunately, will impact our infrastructure assets around the world. The challenge for this is that no one's actually been able to adequately price adaptation costs. The World Economic Forum lists it as the third most important risk facing the world. UNEP indicate that in developing countries, $140 billion to $300 billion of investment will be required per annum by 2030 under a 2-degree world. In Australia, no real quantification has actually taken place. We know that governments spend 10 times on disaster recovery to 1 on disaster preparation. Now, the last figure I saw, which is quoted in the report, is around Deloitte. Deloitte estimate that government spends around $2.3 billion per annum on disaster response post the impact, right? And that's only about 11% of the total economic cost of disasters and natural environmental disasters, so storms, cyclones, etc., bushfires. It was funny, when I wrote those down and I was reading the report, I got horribly depressed. But there is glimmers of hope, superheroes to my right. So without further ado, each of us, what we thought we would do is sort of share some insights about what is actually happening on the ground in terms of adaptation and resilience in infrastructure. 5 minutes each or so, then open it up to the floor for questions. I've got a couple to lead with as well. So we're actually almost in order as well. So we've got Ruben from GRESB. We'll start off with a bit of a framework discussion, followed by Steve Lambert from the NAB, bringing his wealth of banking experience internationally and domestically. And then Kate Bromley will give us a great insight into how fund managers look at a lot of the infrastructure risks from an adaptation perspective. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ruben.
Thank you, Chris. 5 minutes only. That's going to be a bit of a challenge, just like the challenge to keep you guys awake until the lunch break. So, let's start with a sort of a nutshell. I work at GRESB, and we assess environmental, social, and governance performance of real asset portfolios, so real estate and infrastructure, on behalf of currently about 70 institutional investors, with the aim to enhance and protect shareholder value. And they use our data not just to screen any potential investments related to real estate or infrastructure, but more importantly, they want to engage with the managers in order for the managers to get committed, get more transparent, and to take action. So we do this, and I'll skip the whole underlying process, being conscious of time, but in principle, we look at how investment managers, such as fund managers or asset operators, report on a whole range of indicators. But quite recently, we also did a survey amongst our institutional investor members. And the great news is there that indeed Almost all of them use ESG data to make better informed investment decisions, and certainly with the aim to try to understand the underlying risks that are associated with those assessments. And what we see is that they do not just require their investment managers to report on material ESG-related indicators, including risks such as climate change, but increasingly they're requiring them to explain how these risks are managed. At the same time, we also see that only 35% set specific targets in terms of ESG performance, which tells me that still investors, like you in a room, value transparency and disclosure around ESG-related risks above actual performance, which could potentially be a hurdle for further improvements, but I'll get to that later on. And of course, it's clear that many different investors have many different approaches to making sure that their managers are both compliant, aligned, and incentivized. Now, if we look at the different asset managers and operators within real estate and infrastructure, then we can see that actually the majority of them undertake environmental risk assessments within their portfolios and at the asset level as well. However, we do see that when it concerns climate-related risks or adaptation, that these risks form only the minority, so they're not that common when they do a risk assessment related to environmental issues. And I think this is caused because of the fact that investment managers still consider the really more tangible risks, such as contamination at the asset level, health and safety, but even regulatory risks, to be more material for them and for their decisions in terms of their operations. So the question is, and I hope we can have a discussion about that, what is the role of investors, but also policymakers, to increase this awareness around climate change-related risks at the asset level and portfolio level for real assets? But of course, it's not just about the investors and the managers, it's also about the debt providers, Steve. Because they have a role to play as well. And in our research show that increasingly, the real estate lenders do incorporate ESG practices into lender risk management, underwriting, due diligence, and valuation. And if we look specifically at how they review sustainability-related risks as part of standard underwriting, then we can see that the vast majority do this. However, the risks that are included also are quite different. So obviously also here, the more tangible risks, such as natural disaster, including flooding, bushfires, are included in those reviews, namely by 88%. However, climate change adaptation or resilience assessments are included much less often. So what can we do there to perhaps even educate some of the banks, including the commercial banks here in Australia? Our results also show that the real estate lenders do monitor the existing loan portfolio exposure to natural disaster risks, such as flooding or bushfires. And it's obvious from our results that different real estate lenders have different approaches to this kind of exposure, obviously depending on, let's say, their risk averseness. And at the same time, and I think that should be perhaps key to this panel discussion, we also know that exactly the commitment of both the financiers, so the debt providers, as well as the equity providers, the investors, to invest and finance specific climate actions will actually make a huge push for the industry in terms of real estate portfolios and infrastructure portfolios. I can see that most of you are still awake, so mission accomplished so far. But I'm very curious to learn more about in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruben. I'll pass over to Steve Lambert from the NAB to give an insight onto his exploration.
Yeah, thanks very much. And that was actually really useful, Ruben, as a taxonomy, I thought. So I'm actually not going to talk to any slides. So I just thought I'd talk about two or three things. At a practical level, as the way we're thinking about this whole topic at NAB. So I guess the first bit is often around adaptation finance. I think there's a huge awareness of the potential size of this and the need for specific adaptation finance as it relates to climate change. So I think there's not a question of is this a big thing? That's not even a debate. The issue a little bit that we have is often it's seen as often just BAU, frankly. There's a lot of adaptation finance, particularly as it relates in the private sector, which is sort of going on. It's lending at the corporate level. It's being, normal loans being repaid through the normal course of business, and often just not captured in any of the models or any of the systems. So that's the first bit. There's definitely a piece in the data around what is adaptation versus, good risk management, good business as usual, a good business running their business sustainably. So that's the first bit. Second bit I think we'll find is that sure, in our systems, in our models, we definitely there are projects that are definitely being created. I guess I'm thinking here things like the desalination plants, which would be an example of classic adaptation finance, and they're very clear. But broadly across the portfolio, it's not as obvious to see. And one of the challenges that when we talk about adaptation as a specific in a project sense, there's not that many examples that you can actually see, and that's actually often what the institutional investors, want to fund. They actually want to see they don't want the generic, they want the specific project. So the number of projects available domestically is relatively limited. If I step back a little bit for us, and I do want to talk a little bit around because I think all the commercial banks, I think all four in Australia, are taking into account multiple elements of environmental risk in our risk assessment. Certainly at the top end of town and largely right through the organisation. Probably all of us now have done work across our whole portfolio around where we see the key risks, be it through mitigation, through transition risks, etc. The challenge is, and we then focus on what are those high-risk industries. So we've looked at the whole portfolio, typically at the industry level, and we thought, using a different methodology of thinking around risk, we've sort of categorised every industry that we have lend to, and sort of put them in high, medium, and low, and then started really then focusing on those high-risk areas. What are we going to do there? What's it look like? The challenge is, as you get into the data and you get into it in Australia, is basically trying to overlay the geographic risks around different things, say bushfires or flooding or any of those sort of heat, the cost of heat, etc. Trying to get that micro level data overlaid onto these big portfolios is really difficult. And that's one of the areas I think that where there is a gap domestically. The cost of trying to do that analysis even in a region is very expensive. I think we're all probably trying to do it. There's very little sharing of data. There's very little, I'd say, information flow back at the government level back into the private sector. And I think that's where it starts for us. To us to really be able to advise our clients around the opportunities at adaptation, you need that data. You need to go to that next level. So that's sort of where it's at for us at the moment.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just have to talk really loud. Oh, it's back on. Thank you very much. Now, a different angle will be from Kate. She's looking from a QIC perspective as well. Give your insights, Kate, and then we'll come back to questions.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to give a hopefully practical perspective today on what QIC is doing in addressing climate adaptation across its assets. But first of all, I just wanted to make a couple of contextualising remarks, if in fact that's a real word. So QIC is a diversified alternatives manager, and this has meant that to date the focus of our ESG thinking has been very much in the real assets space. To further sort of contextualize in an infrastructure context, another important point to make is that particularly as an investor in direct infrastructure, given the nature and the size of these kinds of assets, we typically find ourselves being a co-investor in these assets. Whereas if we look to our real estate portfolio, more typically we are an owner-operator of these assets. We hold a larger number of smaller assets. So this ownership structure is an important point to draw out, because as a co-investor, what we are looking to typically do is raise issues at board level with the assets that we invest in, and set expectations around some of the material ESG factors that we see, such as climate change and in particular adaptation. This also means that it's particularly useful when your co-investors are like-minded, as I'm sure Chris will agree with that point. So in terms of infrastructure, QIC has a dedicated team of 38 investment professionals. We currently hold direct investments in 11 assets across the OECD, with approximately $9.5 billion in assets under management. And when I try and outline what the task for us of thinking about addressing physical risk, I think, to put it very simply, it's upon us to define what climate change adaptation means in a very practical sense. What are the very practical actions that we can take in amongst our investment decision making and our asset management decisions to really ensure that we are managing this risk? And I thought that last night, Professor Admiral Chris Barry made the point very well. And to paraphrase, he said that the challenge is trying to be very precise with information, which is at the present time fraught with uncertainty. So trying to, I guess this involves for us understanding what the climate modelling data and the scenario analyses mean at asset level in order to lay the groundwork for effective investment decision making. And we need to do this as efficiently as possible. And this means making effective adaptation decisions in relation to our assets, which, as far as possible with the available information, is commensurate with the level of risk that they are exposed to. So it's very much a process of breaking down the high-level climate projections and turning that into something tangible and practical that we can implement at asset level. So, I concur with Steve's points that this is very much a business as usual type practice. And indeed, as an infrastructure investor, these risks do need to be managed as business as usual, because in some cases we can't avoid them. For example, if we're investing in port infrastructure, these are located on the coast and moving them is simply not an option. So we have to be able to understand them and manage them as part of what we do. So to give you a few examples as to what QIC is currently doing, there are a few things I would draw on. So first of all, we actively engage with our asset managers around the assets we invest in. One advantage of being a direct investor in infrastructure is that we do have the ability to engage at board level through the representation that we hold, and a minimum requirement that is non-negotiable for the QIC infrastructure team is to have board representation on those assets that we invest in. And this provides us with the ability to raise those issues at board level and have that greater level of influence around what we see as being our expectations around managing things like climate adaptation. And a recent example of this is a piece of work that we, in fact, did with the Port of Melbourne. We did it at asset management level, where we worked together to understand what the material ESG issues were and understand how they're being addressed. Secondly, we, over the course of the last year, have started a piece of work which spans QIC's real assets, and it is to understand the resilience of those assets to the physical impacts of climate change. And this is an ongoing piece of work and something which we're developing and refining even as we speak. And this study aimed to look at QIC's real assets located in Australia, map the geographical location of those assets to the climate projections, and look at those projections through the lens of a pathway scenario that are aligned to the Paris Accord. So we could get some high-level sense as to what are the climate variables that each of our assets are exposed to based on those projections and that analysis. And the study covered around 40 assets, and the first phase of that is complete, and we are now looking to again refine that high-level information and get a greater level of detail around those to bring us closer to making some of those practical adaptation decisions. And the last thing that we are doing is in the area of policy advocacy. We see this as a very important step, and QIC's CEO, Damien Frawley, is currently sitting on the Queensland Climate Advisory Council, along with a few others in this room. And this is a key opportunity for us to bring to this discussion the kinds of barriers and challenges and opportunities that we see from an investor perspective as the government looks to develop its climate policy. So just to round off a couple of learnings that have come about so far. Given the complexity of the task and understanding, translating that very high-level climate data into something practical and actionable, we feel that greater shared information around climate modelling would be incredibly beneficial to us in working through these issues. Secondly, the sense that we're getting is that the structural failure of the assets that we invest in is less likely than the asset to be exposed to a disruption to its business operations as a result of climate events. So this means that our work is just as likely to focus on working with asset managers to ensure that they have the appropriate operational systems in place and to restore operations as quickly as possible, but also to ensure that employees and members of the community are safe during times of climate events. And finally, we feel that continued dialogue between government and industry, and also collaborative dialogue between investors, is absolutely key, because this is a very complex issue, and being able to think about it holistically with other stakeholders goes a long way to addressing some of the questions that we have.
Thanks, Kate. Actually, you brought up quite a few things then that are quite meaty to discuss. One of the things initially on is my opportunity to say something around what we do as well, but was the like-minded investment part. We were joking before around adaptations, not as, sexy and front page of an annual report type issue like a solar panel or a wind turbine or whatever it is. It's sort of the business as you go. You fix up an asset, make sure it's ready to brave the storms or bushfires, etc. One of the things that QIC and IFM, or one of the assets we own, is actually Port of Brisbane. And one of the classic examples of resilience or adaptation type work that the asset has undergone is really small investment. Around 400,000, I probably should check my notes, around 400,000 tonnes each year of sediment goes out into the harbour, destroying natural marine life, and actually big cost to the business in terms of both infrastructure, hard infrastructure at the port, but also dredging. The team there basically set on a course. It's a long-term project, right? So that's the importance of having a long-term focus around infrastructure and the like-minded investment houses that can do this. Basically spent a bit of the port's money to plant, I think it was around 4,000 trees up in the Lockyer Valley along the Laidley Creek, and revegetate. As a result, this was actually after, so coming back to the numbers, that's 400,000 tonnes a year. After the 2013 heavy storms, around 2 million tonnes got flushed out into Moreton Bay. So you can sort of see it's a fairly large increase. So the team set about this. So it's a 3 to 5 year project of revegetating. At the moment, it's reduced the sediment that's going out into the bay, saving sort of marine habitat as well as saving the cost for the business as well. It's a trial with Griffith, and hopefully those sorts of ideas of trialling, like I said, maybe that is the front page of an annual report, who knows? But in terms of those sort of things, it goes unsaid, and it's sort of it's an unsung part of infrastructure management that I think needs to be acknowledged as well. One of the key parts about that story, though, is it now is a framework or providing some information for governments about what they can do at a local level and a state level and a national level. And I guess that's the question for the panel I want to start about. Is one of the sessions previously we were talking about the failures and felt a bit doomsday-ish around the policy and the political framework here in Australia. So a question to the panel, maybe we'll move down from this end, Steve, starting from you, about what maybe some examples you've seen on the ground around infrastructure, but also adaptation policies from governments around Australia.
Yeah, what I would say, definitely at a project level, and particularly these very large infrastructure projects, there's a lot of time and thought, and there's a lot of eyes looking at them, and the ability to sort of get a reasonable handle on both climate risk and then potential adaptation techniques happens a lot easier than I would say a normal corporate lend, or like the way you think about a broader business. But even when you sort of do that analysis, I'm thinking as a specific transaction that we've been involved in, albeit a number of years ago now, and it had sort of three, theoretically, 1 in 100 year weather events every year. Well, it was every year there was a 1 in 100 weather event. So and I've actually seen the data when we actually thought about this 1 in 100. Oh well, what's the likelihood of that happening in the next 20 years? Well, we had it every 3 years in a row, and an underground coal mine, it wasn't coal, but an underground mine maybe doesn't, sounds great if there's no water, right? There was an underground mine, and frankly, you can't just pump the water out and start again the next day type thing. So that was it was literally underground for a couple of years, right? So how you actually, even when you do the analysis, there's going to be other things happening. And I think the other bit is that the way you think about the analysis has to change, because we just know that they're not 1 in 100 years anymore. You can't be using that sort of historical analysis to sort of think around risk. So that's the bit. The bit that I'm finding difficult, that there is a lot of analysis on core infrastructure. It could be around water, could be around electricity, and typically that core infrastructure in certain areas, it is an ecosystem in itself. So looking at an individual asset and the risks around what could happen to an individual asset, particularly around sort of a natural disaster, often doesn't tell the full story. If the electricity blows, if it's something that knocks out the electricity, it's actually the knock-on impacts of what that may do to pumps or et cetera, down the line actually causes more grief. So it's how to think about that. That's where it gets really complicated. Looking at an individual asset, you can look at it and you're still going to probably get it wrong, but at least you can think about it. But looking at the system requires a different way of thinking. And that's where I still think we've got a long way to go. The climate data we have, we're doing a lot of work with people like CSIRO, et cetera, and the universities, but still doesn't get down deep enough to really think deeply around how you mitigate that risk. And the other way that we would generally try to mitigate risk is through other markets, and that itself, to be able to price that, you need the data, and that's where I think we could all sort of do a lot more work together.
Thanks. Ruben, actually, talking about the data aspect as well, obviously you've got the measurement frameworks from yours. Is there advice you could give government or even people in this room around what would a good framework would be for collecting and measuring the data, or some insights on that perspective?
Besides using GRASP, great. No, well, it's a good question. Obviously, we learned a lot of things while working with, let's say, all industry stakeholders, both for real estate initially, and then for, let's say, the debt providers and also for infrastructure. I think that the difficult challenge for real asset and real estate investments is that, well, it makes it easy because they're very tangible, and at the same time that also makes them very different. I mean, if you would try to develop a framework around climate change adaptation or resilience, then what are the key metrics or indicators that provide some kind of information in terms of how the managers or the asset operators go about on that? And I mean, even for real estate, which is, well, a building is a building, but we have had our challenges. I think for infrastructure, it's much more complicated. I mean, how do you compare climate change adaptation metrics for an airport or a toll road compared to a renewable power plant, compared to wastewater treatment plants, telecommunication, aged care, healthcare, and even commercial real estate such as office buildings. So I think probably the most important thing is, from our experience, is need to engage with all the relevant stakeholders, try to see where's common ground. And obviously, I'm not from Australia. I think here in Australia, the additional challenge is you have, let's say, federal policies, state policies, and then, let's say, the cities and municipalities, where sometimes, often, in my view, actually the most commitment is because that's where it becomes very tangible and material, and everybody understands what to do. So I would say it's both, let's say, in parallel, getting different stakeholders on board and trying to understand the very specifics of a certain infrastructure sector or subsector, sector or real estate, and also vertically try to involve everyone. And I always say, when we assess, let's say, the performance of this year, the 850 real estate companies, REITs, and funds around the globe, they all think they're different, and they all think they're special. And they say, well, this certain aspect applies less to my organization or my portfolio or the underlying assets, because, and of course, to a certain extent, it's true. So I would say, do not look at the differences, but look at where's the common ground and start working from there. But it will be a challenge anyway.
Yeah, definitely. All right, thank you. Now, I'm conscious, I know we've been running a little bit over time, so I'm going to give advance notice now, because we're eating into lunch, pun intended. Oh, I was waiting to use that joke all morning. Anyway, my son would be so proud. I should have worn the Batman suit. But anyway, he's only 6, by the way, just to put it in context. So just a quick warning, if you've got questions, start sharpening the pencils and vocalising the vocal cords or getting them ready. One question I'll put back to the panel. The first few questions get to go to lunch early. All right. But Kate, first to you. I was just reflecting on the board discussion, the PSS, the Perfect Storm Superannuation Board discussion yesterday. And being a good Queenslander, I'm sure you're familiar with severe weather events around water. Thinking about that as an asset manager, what would be a couple of things that your team would traditionally look at doing, if, you know, in terms of acquiring an asset that maybe hadn't built in adaptability into it? What sorts of things would you start to think about and look for?
So I guess the first point to make is that during the acquisition phase and the due diligence phase, you can make some high level assessments around what the types of risks or challenges a particular asset may be facing. But once you move, once the transaction has occurred and you get the keys to the door and you get a little bit more information around what is actually happening, that is the opportunity when you can really see what's going on and also work with the asset manager to make recommendations and bring issues to the forefront which you feel are important to address. And that is the model that we've very much put in place in working, for example, to use the Port of Melbourne example again. That is precisely what we did, is go and undertake our own independent ESG review of the asset and outline for ourselves what we believe to be the key ESG issues, and then understand how the asset manager is addressing those and what are the processes and systems in place. So I think it's very much it's using that active engagement to its fullest extent and working with the company to influence and communicate your expectations very clearly and make the case for being very proactive and implementing ESG actions in a very clear and very prioritised way. And we work with the businesses quite intensively to ensure that the recommendations we make work in with the other priorities of the business, and we just try to be very, very practical and pragmatic around how we action these in a systematic way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Infrastructure is not just a built environment, it's a service to community and customers. Now, I'll look out in these bright shining lights, but, right there in the middle, easy.
Hi, thanks. It's Kate McKenzie from Climate Kick. It's a very interesting panel. Thanks for all the detail. I was really interested in some of the comments about the data availability in particular. I know in Australia there's a lot of issues some with publicly owned data and the availability of it. I guess I'm wondering, particularly Stephen and Kate, but also Ruben, on the industry side, do you think that do you think we're going to see that addressed in the private sector side, from collaborating and working towards kind of an open approach to this challenge around data? Because as you mentioned, Steve, everyone's trying to do the same thing. Do you think there's going to be more collaboration, or is this research and information going to be seen as a more competitive tool or advantage?
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, I haven't landed myself on that. Sometimes on some things, I had a meeting this morning, and it's something we're trying to work on. And the idea is, if we do it, it'll be for the industry. So there's certainly some things we do. Let's bring it out there, and let the industry copy it, if you like, because that's how you get the next wave of innovation. I think that's happened a lot. When we first started working on our first green bond with the Climate Bond Initiative, that is effectively now the standard. Most others green bonds have been done, at least from a bank's point of view. It's sort of broadly same. In some things, I think it is a comparative advantage. Often, we always hear around, particularly in banks, a lot of discussion around, okay, the data is really important. How do you monetize the data? Half the time, we still haven't worked out how to do that. So, not that we're still not thinking about it, but we still haven't worked out how to do it. So, but sometimes there is this tendency, it's my data, it must be worth something. I won't share it. So, there is that challenge. I think we're finding some really great collaboration with a number of the universities, so that's working well, and that then gets it out. A lot of the stuff, it's somewhat, I wouldn't desensitise, but it gets it out there more in the domain. But I don't think we talk about it enough as an industry, frankly. There's too many things we all try to do ourselves, and frankly, we collaboratively, we get in a better position. It's the same with the government, with the data, with that.
And I think looking at Australian specific, so that's also one of the main reasons why Australia pops up as, let's say, the leading region when it concerns ESG performance within our real estate assessment. I think much more than in other regions, there's this unique willingness to collaborate, to come up with new standards, to determine what data we should look at, and then to share best practices in terms of approaches, understanding the data, and then incorporating that into, let's say, the business operations and the assets. And that sort of collaborative spirit, even though being competitive, obviously, I think it's quite unique for Australia, and perhaps the most important opportunity to really get this off the ground and going in that respect. One additional note, I think, at the asset manager level, because the question I've been asked mostly is, Ruben, resilience is great, climate change adaptation, fine, I want to be green, but what's in it for me? Which is a very logical question to ask, obviously, if you're managing a mandate on behalf of your investors. So I think we should provide more clarity around, let's say, the financial implications of both being able to manage downside risks, but perhaps more importantly, to utilize upside potential in terms of making that change towards climate change focus and adaptation and resilience.
Thanks.
And I had one quick point to make. My comment, Kate, would be that I would absolutely encourage collaboration. I think there is, generally speaking, a good level of collaboration across the ESG community as it stands, but there are benefits to be gained by working in this way. Just to refer back to Chris's case study around the Port of Brisbane, we talk a lot about climate change and adaptation being a very complex issue, and I think that in delving into some of those complexities, there are synergies to be gained, such as the port having benefits from this implementation of the planting of trees further up the valley, which also in turn benefited the farmers who were, reducing their environmental impact. So I think that I would strongly encourage it, and for us to find the benefits of doing so.
Thanks. And I think we've got time for one quick question. Is there one at the back? There's one at the front too. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Nina James from Investor Property Group, but I also represent the Australian Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilient and Safer Communities, which is by far the longest name of any roundtable probably in the world, with Jessie from Westpac. The roundtable is conveniently, to tie the last two questions together, it's a collaborative roundtable which has Westpac, IAG, Munich Re, Investor and Optus and the Red Cross, and we've been working together collaboratively since 2012, commissioning independent research around the business case for resilience investment. We've had very little luck, coming back to the policy question that Chris posed, we've had very little luck influencing government policy, but we have had great engagement with industry sectors and with very much global recognition of the work that we've been doing. The real challenge we're having is really getting the rubber to hit the road, and where we're starting to look now is how do we start to engage directly the financial sector in producing products where there could be investment opportunities in resilience. So my question to the panel is, given that there is a policy vacuum and a government reluctance to engage or to invest money, what do you think the financial sector needs to drive investment into resilience?
Cracker of a question. All right. Does anyone have a crack? One of the aspects, and it's covered in part of the report as well, is for there's lots of different methods, and I know Steve's been thinking about some as well, but finding out who, and Kate just mentioned the farmers benefiting as well from that resilience project as well. So actually one of the things is working out who the beneficiaries are of various adaptive or resilient type projects. And I know I'm not going to propose a tax onto them, but actually working out for that, the port spent money, and through that project we identified a whole range of other beneficiaries. So that might be part of the solution, and actually working out who is the benefits, who benefits from it. Can you securitise some of those benefits over a longer period of time and then put into a bond facility or whatever it might be? So that's sort of where my thinking went initially, when we talked about that. Steve or anyone on there? Kate?
Look, you mentioned the policy vacuum, Nina, and this is probably not very revelationary to say this, but the work that we have done at QIC with our infrastructure team into the energy sector really does come down to the fact that we need a nationally cohesive policy framework to first of all set the rules of the game for investing in this way. But also, policy has the opportunity to change the rules of the game and to incentivise particular behaviours. So, in entering into broad-ranging dialogues, including government and policymakers, I think is still a key part of what we need to do to move things forward in that regard.
I think so. Why I'll get two bits. There's this activity that's already happening. It doesn't rely on government. There's a whole bunch of stuff that, as I said at the start, there's quite a lot of adaptation finance just occurs from, in a bank's point of view, it's just a normal loan to a client that the proceeds is going to be used for adaptation, and it's just part of business as usual. It's a good business, sound business decisioning. It's occurring. It doesn't get captured in a lot of the data because we don't think about, this is specifically for adaptation finance, but there's a lot of that happens. It happens a lot in SME, it's happening in agri, it's happening right across our book. That's the first bit. The second bit, though, is that There's definitely to mobilise large amounts of money. So, and there can be some individual transactions that are done in decent size. I mean, both the Victorian and the Queensland government green bonds that we were involved in, both of those had part of the proceeds was used for adaptation finance, both cases. The transaction for Australian Catholic University I referenced the other day, the Australia's first sustainability bond, an element of that was also tied to adaptation finance. So it does happen, but on the other hand, the things that government can do would be things like, I don't know, let's just say, if you do believe that lending to, for more sustainable projects will have less risk over time, that's not reflected at all in, say, in the bank's capital standards. I hold the same amount of capital for something, which possibly is not going to be sustainable in the long term. So that'd be an example. Trying to deal to some of these issues of, basically public-private data type things would help a lot. Enabling more, more contestability, in projects that the government gets involved in. That would be useful. There's a whole range of different things, but I actually think often, we can't wait for government to basically do very much. You sort of have to sort of do what you can do, and hopefully they'll come along for the ride, and maybe they'll never quite get there exactly, but you've sort of we got to do it ourselves largely where we can. But the challenge with that is that going to be scale? Sometimes, not always. So that's all I said.
Thank you, and thank you to my fellow panellists as well. We're available for kids' parties and superheroes for the battle against climate change impacts. But thank you all of you for paying attention, and we're back to lunch now. All right, thanks very much.